Welcome to this fourth edition of CEO Insights. Today, I want to talk primarily about financial sustainability and in particular, the Financial Sustainability Summit that ACPA hosted in Canberra last Thursday. But firstly, I just want to talk for a moment about our state conferences. Last week, we held our New South Wales State Conference in Sydney, and we had over 500 people attend from across the sector. We have our Victorian State Conference coming up next week in Melbourne. So for those of you who are in Victoria, please make sure you book a ticket or bring along members of your team to our state conference. The feedback so far from the state conferences we've held and other state events in Tasmania, in Queensland, in South Australia, and last week in New South Wales has been fantastic. And clearly, with many hundreds of you turning out to those events, it shows that there's a real appetite for that networking and that collective learning. So I encourage you to come along to the Victorian Conference and then later to the WA State Conference so that you can benefit from that networking and that opportunity to talk to your colleagues and learn about what's going on in the sector. But we have to talk about financial sustainability. It's a constant topic of concern for us as a sector and for us at ACPA, as you would fully understand. We were welcoming of the investment that the federal budget a few weeks ago put into our sector with $12.4 billion of investment into aged care that helps to ease the immediate financial pressures. However, our number one recommendation in our budget submission a few months ago now was that we needed a national conversation about long-term financial sustainability, and particularly the way we were going to pay for aged care, including whether there need to be increased consumer contributions to care for those who can afford to pay. So we welcomed the government commitment to a financial sustainability task force, and we're very hopeful that the scope and membership of that task force will be released imminently. And we were also very grateful to see that the Prime Minister 2 Sundays ago launched the draft care economy strategy, which dealt with not just the things that we often see governments talk about of needing to see better quality services and better quality care to the community and better quality jobs and workforce, but also a whole section of that strategy talking about financial sustainability. So that's the first time we've seen a document from government in recent decades that talks about those three pillars: better care, better jobs, and more appropriate workforce, and how we actually pay for it. And it asked some really challenging questions about consumers and their ability to contribute towards their own services. So last Thursday, we held our Financial Sustainability Summit in Old Parliament House in Canberra. On the 1st of June, we brought together about 50 stakeholders from across our sector. We had providers of every type, every size, every ownership structure, every geography, every state and territory, as well as leaders from the union movement, the consumer movement, and academics, universities, people from Stuart Brown and others, as well as government, to come together to talk about this key challenge of how we make our sector sustainable. The purpose of that conversation was really to see where we agree and where we don't. The government has made it very clear that they're up for the conversation about increased consumer contributions, but only if it is supported by the community. And so this was our first step into helping have that national conversation and start to open up those options, making sure that we're being really honest about the sustainability issues we've got now, but also the fact that the Royal Commission said we need to massively improve access to aged care and quality of services. And the only way we can do that is if we can pay for it. So in that summit, we heard presentations on the research that has recently been released by ComplySpace, for example, on the increased willingness of Australians to see their older relatives use their own money to pay for their care, rather than necessarily passing it all on through inheritance. $67 billion a year is passed on from one generation to the next through inheritance. The average person who receives an inheritance in Australia is 52. These are not first home buyers, which is often one of the concerns we hear around inheritance. And a vast majority of people, when surveyed, will say that they would rather see a smaller inheritance and have their older relatives use their own money to pay for their own care so they can have a better life in their last years. So that gave us the opportunity to really talk about how we actually engage the community in that conversation. It seems like community attitudes are actually changing. The other things that we talked about were what the different options might be. Should there be a dedicated levy for aged care? That was something that the Royal Commission recommended, but has basically been dropped like a stone ever since. That's back on the table. There wasn't 100% agreement on how you might do it, how much it should be, what it should actually be used for, whether it should just be aged care or, as in the care economy strategy, cover disability and other kinds of social services, childcare, for example. But that conversation was very active, and there was some support for that type of structure. Also, should there be some sort of social insurance model whereby people might invest in an insurance product or a government-run fund, as we do when we get our third-party insurance for our vehicles, for example? And then the more consumer-focused options of, do we ask people with means to pay to cover the whole cost of their accommodation and their daily services in residential aged care, as opposed to just a proportion of those costs? There was also very active conversation about the need to ensure we don't create a two-tier system. So providing better levels of basic care and services to those who can afford to pay than to those who cannot. And there was very clear consensus around the room from all of the stakeholders that that was not something that we want to advocate for. We do not want to see people, for example, receiving more minutes of nursing care in residential facilities if they can afford to pay for it. That is not something that anybody was supportive of. But the outcomes were really positive. We had a great conversation. We've seen different parts of our system and our stakeholder groups come together and respectfully discuss some really challenging and complex questions. The next step for us is to produce a white paper, and we're going to get member input on that white paper, people who weren't able to be at the summit. We want to hear your views as well, so that we can use that as an input to the Financial Sustainability Task Force that the government is setting up. So you'll hear much more from us about this, and we're really excited to use the inputs of this really landmark conversation, a conversation that, let's remember, nobody has felt able to have publicly in 20 years, that we as your peak are now spearheading, along with our partners from Uniting Care, Baptist Care and Anglicare Australia, who helped us put together the summit, the former partners of the AACC. We are having that conversation loudly, and we are absolutely ready to continue that conversation until we get a solution to the future sustainability of our sector. So just in closing, please look out for that white paper, the consultations that we're going to have to get your feedback on what came out of the summit. And also come along to our state conference in Victoria, if that's where you're based, or also our WA state conference, and get the same benefit that your colleagues in New South Wales, in Queensland, in Tasmania and in South Australia have already had, and spend a couple of days with your colleagues across the sector and with us at ACPA and our partners and stakeholders, benefiting from that collective networking and collective learning opportunity that we all missed for so long during COVID. Thank you.